Welcome to the panel discussion on cybersecurity and the odd couple. Greatly appreciate you all joining us today. I'm Devlin, Liles, the president of Improving's Houston office, and I'll be hosting, moderating, and sometimes participating. I'll be asking questions to the panelists, as well as I'd encourage you to do so with the QA feature that's built into the live stream. Feel free to take a look on the right side of your screen. You can vote on some questions that have already been asked there as well. We'll be using a mixture of prepared questions, as well as some of those from the audience. Now introducing our panel. I'm joined by some great thought leaders in this space in cybersecurity as well as business technology. With us, we have Jay Spears, VP of Information Technology for CEC Entertainment. Jay's led multiple companies through digital transformation, cloud adoption, and in each of these faced data security, privacy, and a growing cybersecurity footprint. Erik Boemanns, VP of Enterprise Architecture and the head of Improving Cybersecurity Practice, one of our most experienced thought leaders in the space of cybersecurity and how to prevent as well as remediate incidents. Erik, Jay, thank you guys for joining us.
Glad to be here today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right, so diving right in, we've seen a ton of activity in the last 6 months. We've seen everything from breaches that show up almost weekly on the news to the Gartner study that said 99% of cloud security problems are customer created. Have you been seeing just a different world that we live in, or is this the culmination of change? Erik, what are you seeing in that space?
I think it's the culmination of several different changes. It is the cloud adoption has accelerated, right? But at the same time, we had a lot of people working from home for the first time for a lot of big organizations. And so those kind of intersect together. And at the same time, we've known forever that every size business has a value to the hacking community. And so every business has a value. People are now at home using home computers, using new laptops that were bought off of Best Buy shelves. And all those things are kind of creating a ripe environment for the activity, and we're just seeing the result of that.
That makes sense. Jay, how about you? Are you seeing different things than you were seeing a few months ago?
Yeah, I think we are. I guess I would point out that the pandemic and some of the consequences of that, as you already described, were certainly creating opportunity. But I think that the reality of large criminal organizations out there actively recruiting developers to come be hackers, and the willingness of nation states to something between turn a blind eye and fully support that has changed the game in the last year. Today we're faced with challenges and the scope of attacks and a ability to attack that we have not seen in the past, and it is developing forward. Believe me, they see it as a business case, and they are investing and developing forward at a rate that may exceed our ability to respond.
So you guys both kind of touched on this shifting landscape in which we're seeing active work in this at a scale that we haven't experienced in the past. How does that change the way you approach security than the way you might have a couple of years ago? And start with you, Jay. Like, how are you dealing with that differently than you used to?
So I'll take the pragmatic part first, right? The old style of defenses are becoming less and less viable to really maintain. The diversity of endpoints, the ability to implement real zero trust. These are hard things to do and expensive things to do, and we're all running a business that needs to make a profit. So in some context, we're buying insurance and making sure that we're meeting the standards for the insurance to help protect us, and we're in a position where we are at least prepared to pay meaningful amounts of money should we become one of the victims you see on TV. The flip side of that, and particularly around cloud, I can't tell you how many people have called me and said, hey, we can help you set up SD-WAN or a VPN to your cloud providers. And I'm like, that's not really my goal. to make another tunnel where any problem they have can be transmitted to me and any problem I have can be clearly transmitted to them. That is not my goal. I want to treat each one of these platforms as its own security environment and treat it as a zero trust point. I would rather have every hacker in the world have a view of my IP address and know that I'm defending the inside of that box thoroughly than pretend that putting a VPN between us is somehow helping solve that problem, because it doesn't.
That makes sense. Erik, how are you seeing this shift? Like, is the advice you're giving shifted from what it was a few years ago? Is the things we're doing to help protect clients different?
I think, yeah, it's shifted in the sense that we have some new things to talk about. So all the old things still matter, right? About password security, identity management, all those, but they're not enough. VPNs is the great example, right? A lot of the attacks we're seeing right now are over VPN accounts, either passwords that were released into the wild, or there's actually exploitable VPN connections out there where you can, because of a non-updated firewall, you can actually grab the password of the last person logged in, you're in. So it's that shift off of how do we secure the old world to let's not even have that world set up. Let's not have VPNs that echoing Jay exactly. And so how do we build environments that are even to the extent where we see a production cloud environment where a human user doesn't really have access to production, right? We've got processes and mechanisms, automation that controls that. So there's still a way in to do things, and you got to protect those ways, but it is not you are not as a person remoting into a server in the cloud anymore. That should be something that just should be such an edge extreme case that we don't even need to think about it, right? That's a goal from a consulting, from a how do we architect systems, how do we talk to clients, is don't even build the whole to begin with and then try to cover it, right? So take that step back and build things from a secure core that then builds out on that. Zero trust is definitely kind of the philosophy that we're following, but as Jay said, it's expensive and hard as well, so there's always nuance there.
Yeah, and so this hits on something that in a recent study by IBM, they mentioned that human error is the cause of 95% of breaches, right? That 19 out of 20 breaches could be avoided if humans weren't a part of it. And making sure that a human being can't log into a production server, those things, that makes sense, right? But at some point, we still have to interact with people, right? They're interacting with us in the economy, they're interacting with us as employees, logging into our systems and using them. How do we solve that when it seems to be the weakest part of the chain are us, right? Like, I've gotten away from using passwords, right? And I have a generator that does that for me now. I don't even know my passwords, but I still have one password that gets me in there. And right, and then there's biometrics and all that. Like, at some point, do we have to cut the human out of security entirely? And is that possible? So, Erik, I'll start with you, and I see you nodding along.
Right.
How do we cut out the human problem?
Yeah, I think it's different layers. Why is the person there, right? So we certainly can reduce the footprint of humans administering and acting on the production world. We have customers that are also using our production system. Otherwise, why do we have a production system? And so the old school concept of least privilege, I say it's old school. It was not always adopted in the old world, but it still remains super relevant today, so that when you do have to let someone in, it is for a reason, for a purpose, and limited in the scope that makes sense. So customers, yes, they have access to the website. Administrators, though, only have an access that you have kind of pre-approved, preordained as a valid way and a valid time. And so you have monitoring, you have all sorts of things happening around that. So I can't use my login to access a server anymore. I have to go check out a login from a system that I can then get access for an hour. I've reported why. Devlin knows why that I have. Devlin knows that I'm accessing it. He knows why I'm accessing it. And then all of that gets logged and monitored and feeds into like a SIEM or some kind of system that is also paying attention. Because to answer your original question, at that level, we do have to get the humans out. So while yes, you got an email that I'm in the system, there are so much data that's relevant to understanding the security that we've got to rely on machines to analyze that data, understand it, and find the anomalies and the trends that indicate something may be happening. So that, again, the assume breach philosophy, right, is assume you are breached, how would you know? And that's through logging and through monitoring those logs through automated systems, not by people anymore.
Makes sense. Jay, when you look at building these things for people who are going to interact with it daily, that are going to either be your customers or be the people serving your customers, how do you approach that without adding friction that makes the business struggle?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's, I guess, a couple of things that we're actively trying to do. Taking the infrastructure as a service, right, where the whole thing remains invisible and I can't touch it, even if I want to, right? That's a layer I appreciate, and it doesn't absolve us of risk. It moves the risk to the other team, right? And I think the FireEye SolarWinds issues are good examples of that, right? And there are still privileged accounts and privileged software in our environments today. I don't care whether you're using SCCM from before the Stone Age or one of the newer products. I'm a Tanium fan, so but those products have the same privileges that we're exactly talking about trying to manage. And if those vendors are breached slowly through these same kinds of infiltrations, they become the source of a different kind of problem. And we've seen huge examples of that in the news, catastrophic, I would argue, examples of that in the news. So thinking about that entire profile is the job, and it's hard. It's really hard. Now I'm gonna go back and try to answer your question. I think making end user interaction with platforms on a least privileged basis is the right answer. If every person can only do one penny of damage, and I know I can limit my bad actors to a certain degree, I can manage that risk, and I can business allocate that cost, right? What I can't do is let somebody get to the backside of that and take it all. And so how we interact with those back office systems is that really critical question. And how do I authenticate? And getting multi-factor, biometric, no password authentication strategies is an evolving way to better detect, not prevent, better detect when somebody is attacking you.
So you've both mentioned kind of this assume you're breached or know when you're being attacked or know the evidence of it. Mm-hmm. How do we do that in a world that the data is moving quickly? There's a ton of it, and the patterns are getting more and more varied. Mm-hmm. So starting with the user detection thing that you were just talking about, Jay, like how would you know? Like, is there tooling you're using? Is there systems you're relying on? Like, how do you structure for something's wrong that doesn't look wrong?
Right, and this is where I think people can't do it anymore. I think you're looking for vendors who are integrating machine learning and AI technologies in platforms, products like Darktrace and Cisco Umbrella. We just changed our endpoint protection platform to a non-virus definition style platform that's looking at user behavior, data transmission, all of those aspects on the device to say, this don't look right. What should we do about it? And I even like them better because they say, I'm going to turn this off until somebody tells me to turn it on. I'm going to stop the breach while it's occurring and wait for Erik or Devlin or Jay or my CISO to come and say, I've reviewed this and this is unusual, but it's actually legitimate. Or, wow, it's great we caught this now, right? Which is more often the case.
That makes sense. And the automated intervention definitely plays into that. Kind of pivoting it to Erik, is there a standard toolkit that, for folks who are sending going, I want some of that we typically point them to, or is this something that has to be bespoke and it's got to be, custom structured for somebody?
So it's a bit of both, right? There are definitely some big players, FireEye, CrowdStrike, Microsoft itself has products that are in that space. and they're not as bad as they used to be. Microsoft has huge advancements in security, so but at the same time, the industry recognizes that sometimes you don't want all your eggs in that basket, so those third-party vendors do help. But very few of those products are just run the installer and sit back and watch the system handle it for you. So there's that next level of how do I configure, tune. So exactly, you talked about AI modeling the behavior. What is normal behavior? But the flip side is also, if I turn on all the gauges to max, have I just created so much friction to my users that they no longer can do their jobs? So there's that tuning, that understanding of what the tools are capable of that still has to happen to make it the right solution for the problem. And all the costs, there's each of those has different licensing models, different prices. So you can't just say this is the best one for everybody. There are great products out there, but they're all great in their own ways.
Yeah, I just want to pile on that. As somebody operating a bunch of retail stores, I can't go out and buy a $50,000 network device for all of my stores and think that's going to be okay, right? You're whacking off significant profit from the ability of the business to run. So we have to look for multiple solutions that fit the business architecture you're defending.
Yeah,
that makes sense. So you both mentioned different tools. You mentioned the structure, the pricing, et cetera. But then we also hear about the SolarWinds type things and the IT supply chain breaches that propagate out to customers. How do you go about the diligence? Can we ever know if the tools we're selecting are solid and valid and they're going to help us, or we've just created a vector that we trust and so we're not looking at it? Like, Erik, when you're walking somebody through this, how do you know? What's the diligence that I need to go do on a tool to go, yes, that's worth it, or whoa, stay away?
Yeah, I think we have kind of a standard concept of diligence, market recognition, Gartner quadrants, all those sort of things, but that's not going to tell you that SolarWinds is hacked, right? That is, it would have looked like a great product 12 months ago, but I think it's at this point, if we're going to assume breach about our own systems, assume it about the systems you're installing, the supply chain, the third parties that you're bringing in. To borrow that phrase, who's going to watch the watchers, right? So how do we have that dual? You almost end up needing a couple different products in the system from different vendors with enough separation that you have the ability to say, so I've got CrowdStrike on all my machines. If CrowdStrike were compromised, how do I know? So is there something else that I have layered in that's aware, that's paying attention? Hopefully not just buying something twice, because cost, and also it will kill the performance of machines if I'm installing 3 different security clients on it. But the kind of that behavior, having the logging, having the different multiple ways to be aware and pay attention, really have to be it. We had a similar issue, just quick story on that. As the SolarWinds story was unfolding, Team City, a build environment, was, for example, linked to the story. Not ever implicated, but just there's some cross lines drawn. And so if your build environment is what's building your software and it's compromised, then the presumption is all the software you build is compromised. So can you, as if you're building a software lifecycle, have a separate kind of sandbox process that also builds your software, takes a look at the output of that, and that way you have kind of this almost competing reality concept of, here's the main one that I trust. Can I also replicate a different way to produce that same result and compare them at the end, so that I'm looking at, is my build environment, is my production server the problem? Well, I have a twin. You think of the digital twin concept from manufacturing and all that. Is there a similar idea that you can bring to the security so that you can actually run a parallel process with a different set to do that comparison? Hard to scale that, but so you pick highest risk is to think about that.
That makes sense. And so when we look at this, there's a lot there, right? There's the dual tooling, and there's the pieces of it all. Like, it sounds expensive. It sounds like a lot of friction. And so I'm going to aim this at Jay and go, do we just get okay with the fact that at some point we're all going to have to pay for it, and it's an insurance conversation, not a prevention conversation? Because no matter what we do, we're either going to kill the profit of the business or deal with a breach at some point.
I think that is where we live today. I can tell you that at the audit committee, we regularly have the conversation of when, not if, and how, right? That's a regular conversation, because today's world is broken. The question about how to fix it, and I will say here, whether you go the government route or the a cooperative nonprofit organization route, we need our own cyber engineers testing and measuring and evaluating products at the lowest level, right? Taking the packets apart and looking for problems. If we're not going to come together and fund that, no one. This is one village trying to defend the Huns, right? It's not a winning proposition. You cannot win this by yourself. We will only win this working together and saying this isn't how we want business to be. And there will always be criminals who will want to circumvent that. I'll pick on development because it's the smallest thing in my organization today. And I grew up in the development environment, right? That was the most important thing to me at one point in my career. And today I say, only develop software that distinguishes you in the marketplace. If you can buy it, right? Build on the economy of scale of multiple users and their security reviews and the multiple chances to catch problems without you being the only one. When we get in the development groove, I think open source is as much of the problem risk today as the build environment. And I would argue, Eric, while I like your principle of twins, if you really make twins and it's Jenkins that's hacked, you're not getting anywhere. If it's Bitbucket that's hacked, you're not getting anywhere, right? Twins are hard to do without bringing the problem to the second place.
Exactly.
Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time. So it's to me, it's one of those things about changing the topology and the profile, limiting your risk at the endpoints as much as you can, but that is finite. There's a finite amount of money and a finite amount of change you can do, and really guarding the other side of it. It's data loss prevention, exfil prevention, detection tools, and automation around that. So you're not waiting for somebody to go, oh, that's awful, we should push a button and stop that. Stop it and deal with the consequences of stopping it when it was okay. Is the approach I'm taking now every day.
That makes sense. I know Jay's gonna smile a little bit because him and I worked together on a product that one of the core design questions was, what if somebody cuts the copper? Like, what if somebody cuts the
steals the copper? What if they steal all the copper?
And so, I mean, we spend a lot of time and money and effort and thought space, and there were some brilliant people working on solving an extreme edge case. In the world that is just fear-driven, there's a lot of fear-mongering cybersecurity out there of do this or you're screwed, do this or you're going out of business. It's hard for business leaders, technology leaders who aren't steeped in this space to know what a strawman argument looks like for cybersecurity so that they can dismiss it, right? If somebody's like, if you don't update your web router, your wireless routers and your ASAs, somebody's gonna, steal all your health information and kill your grandma. Like, how do I know? Like, what's your sniff test for, is this something I should truly be concerned with? I'll start with Erik. You hear a lot of this from clients, both before and after breaches. What's your recognition kind of criteria for real problem or straw man?
So I think it's, how do we know, well, it's how exploitable is this problem, right? So, and then the flip side of that is what is the impact if it's exploited? I think like Jay's saying is, if we have a limited scope on the other side of that exploit, then perhaps we don't care. I don't mean that in a negative sense because we do care, but from a business priorities perspective, right? It doesn't make the cut of we got to spend the time in patching 100,000 store routers, because if you plug a USB device, the Peloton bikes, right? We found out recently they had a vulnerability because of the USB. That probably is not a home consumer concern. It could be a public gym concern, right? But the idea that somebody has to physically plug into a device is an exploit. It matters, but it's not something we all had to rush out and fix, because the likelihood of exploit and the risk of exploit kind of push that down. And so we can either accept that risk or, as Jay said, insure against it, or figure out what other non-technical solutions there are, because the technical solution is just too burdensome or impossible in some situations.
Yeah, I'll extend that. We go through this exercise quarterly in my group and annually with our board and our full leadership team, right? We have some discussions around these topics, and we're doing a risk probability analysis that comes out in dollars, right? That you use to say, wow, if this was to happen, it could cost $30 million, and the risk is low, not super low, just low. And we try to quantify those things, right? And you look at that and go, wow, a $5 million investment to prevent a $30 million failure that could occur in the next 5 years might be a really good investment. There are also places where we've said, I'd rather not have that data than have to defend it.
Yeah.
And credit cards are one of those that's kind of long gone, right? Everybody's virtually, I say that. If you see your card swiped, you're looking at people who have not gotten on the boat. But virtually everybody's doing point-to-point encryption. Like from the device you're sticking your credit card in our stores to the carrier, we aren't involved. It went through our internet connection and left encrypted, and we never touched it. So that kind of, I'm not going to touch that data. I don't need that data. I don't want to know about that data. Removes that problem from being in your scope. So you can there are multiple approaches. You just got to look and see what you can do.
Yeah, and just to, on that credit card idea, we are working with several clients to switch to tokenization so that they don't even get the credit card number anymore, because the device tokenizes it, and it's kind of a one-time use thing. We know the credit bureaus are working on similar things for social security numbers, so that we're not storing, passing those things. There's a way to tokenize those as well. So yeah, don't store the data. Don't store data you don't need for any purpose, right? It's kind of a great philosophy, and yeah, it's not a target.
Even go further. Make a business case for the data you're going to keep. Is it really valuable enough for the risk you carry with it?
Exactly.
And I think it's a new wrinkle to this conversation, right? Because for years it was, all right, how expensive is it to store was the driving concern, because disk space was expensive. And then disk space got cheap, and it was store all the things because we maybe someday will need them, right? And now we're sitting on stacks and stacks and stacks of data that have become part of the target economy. So how do you make that business case when 5 years from now, that data may become more valuable than the entirety of the company that gathered it, which has happened multiple times, right? GitHub got bought for the data in the community, not for its software. Like, how do we predict it? How do we make the business case when we're looking into the crystal ball in the future and going, we're gonna bypass this data? Is there a scale that you use for that, or is it gut feel?
Well, I think you touched on something that's worth repeating, right? These data hubs, data lakes, data oceans that are getting made today, where we're dumping everything in without looking carefully at what's in there, are their own basket of risk, right? And yes, there are some cases where those use and behavior data analytics was very valuable, but it doesn't necessarily need to be unanonymized, right? And so making some decisions about either deriving the metadata from the raw data or anonymizing that data as you're collecting it can really limit your risk. You don't lose the value of the data. You can understand behavior and other analytics, but you don't have to tie it to an individual human being or their credit card or their phone number, which reduces your exposure and the value of it to thieves. It's valuable to business, but it's way less valuable to thieves. So I think there are lots of things like that you could look at, but you have to have that forward-looking data architecture mentality where risk and cybersecurity are always in the conversation. And that's the big shift. If we've done anything in the last maybe 3 years, it's that people like Erik are invited to every conversation. You don't go in there and go, oh, let's make new reports and send them out to fill in the blank, right? Without saying, what would the consequence and where does that data come from? And what if somebody else got it, right? Those conversations get had today more than ever.
Makes sense. So shifting gears a little bit, we've talked about kind of where we're at. Let's talk about where we're going a little bit. We look at kind of your standard next generation car, right? The electric cars coming out from GM, from Ford, from Tesla. They've got 15 to 18 attack surfaces when it comes to cybersecurity. Everything from your smartphone integration to your tire pressure monitoring systems to engine and transmission control, braking, steering, all of it's electronic controlled at this point, right? It's steer by wire, drive by wire. Do we, as an industry, have the maturity to develop software and to build systems that secure those? When we talk about semi-autonomous driving, do we trust that yet? Are we there yet? Or is that the next attack surface where it's not financial, it's life on the line? Kind of get your thoughts on it, Erik, and then I know Jay's going to want to jump in on this one too.
Yeah, I think, we see examples that there's an electric car manufacturer, not Tesla, that its API when it first came out was secured only by the VIN. That's all you need to know to access that car's data. And the VIN is on the windshield, so any car in the lot you can basically access. That's kind of an obvious human error type of thing, right? But it proves the point that even the car manufacturers aren't thinking about that at the big scale. And then as you shrink that into all the different components that are interacting, the fact that all the systems in the car are talking over a bus that is actually accessible and you can communicate on that bus if you do access it, makes them relatively soft targets in the grand scheme of things. I know the manufacturers are doing things with encryption certificates in principle, but again, these are not necessarily foolproof technologies themselves. And I would also say, though, we don't have to wait for self-driving cars to be worried about the life. I think it was this past week, again, VPNs. VPN was weak on a water treatment plant, and somebody tried to hack in and change the formula of the water purification to basically make toxic water what would come out of that plant. So the systems that our lives depend on are already vulnerable even before the self-driving cars hit the road. And so are all things that, how do we make the Internet of Things, whether it's water treatment plants, cars, or in-home devices, have a trustable, secure backbone is a total industry challenge. I think to Jay's earlier point, the industry has to almost be willing to fund a level set of that, because is Amazon going to do it by themselves? Is Tesla going to do it by itself? Well, they're going to reinvent the same thing, but at the same time, each one will have its own set of weaknesses because no one individual organization can cover all those surfaces. So I don't think there's an answer to that, but I think it's a real problem that's here today.
So I'm going to say I think there's an answer. And the point I was going to make while you were talking, Devlin, I'm sorry I tried to interrupt, is I think you're talking about 12 to 15 categories of attack surfaces, because there are hundreds of breachable devices in every one of those things. And I'm going to just answer the question flat no. We're not at a point yet where we can build software and communication systems that we can maintain their security. So far, everything we've made is breakable, right? And until we find a cleaning solution for software and a security solution for the interconnected networks that is durable through the things we're watching right now today. We can't make new things that are going to be any better. Well, let's be careful here. We can't make new things that are going to be impenetrable to those problems. It's not in our wheelhouse yet. Looking backwards at power plants, fuel supply systems, meat packing plants, and the ransomware-based attacks and things you're seeing now. Ransomware was a way to extract money. But other attacks, like the water treatment plant attack, are just as dangerous, right? So looking at the infrastructure of what we have done and thinking about how to clean that up is going to be huge.
That makes sense. So you talked about ransomware. I do want to hit on it, right? Everybody's been hearing about it. It started fairly innocently when we talk about cybersecurity, innocently, right? With personal attacks, right? It was we've detected an issue, click here, talk to a Microsoft person, and it was entirely just phishing to get grandma to install something and then charge her money to take it off. We've moved well beyond that, right? These are tens of millions of dollars moving all the time. There's broker economies for negotiating with them. There's ransomware as a service. Is there an answer? Is there a future in which this isn't something we just have to deal with? Can it be solved at an OS or a hardware level? I mean, Intel just announced, or Microsoft just announced the new secured chip for next-gen PCs that detects some of these processes and intervenes at a hardware level. Like, is there a future where this isn't a part of it, or is it always going to be an arms race? Do you see us solving it, Erik? And if so, kind of where do you see that coming from?
So I think the good news for companies is most of those successful attacks are because they have extremely vulnerable systems. They have systems without backups. They have systems with bad passwords, whatever. So the pain is immediate and it's real. And it is possible, you mentioned Microsoft, in cases that OneDrive, for example, has ransomware protection that works against some types of ransomware. If it detects all your files suddenly changing, it actually creates a shadow backup right then and there so that you can basically click a button, say, go back to yesterday. So from what's the financial impact of ransomware internally? There are ways certainly to protect against that from just existing standard technologies. Preventing it from coming in is probably the one that's the arms race. It only gets smarter, it only gets better. The newsworthy stories are actually pretty simple ways to get in, typically, unfortunately. But we, if you haven't gotten an email today inviting you to click the link, then you're not on LinkedIn, right? I mean, everybody who's on the internet anywhere, they've been priced, they've been put in the list, and they've been targeted with something that makes sense to them so that they can get involved. And so, yes, while if something hit my laptop, I might lose my files. Improving is fine because of the kind of systems we have in place that would limit the scope of that impact. But at the same time, I don't know that there's a way to prevent the overall process because of people, right? The people will always be the weak point there, and all we can do is limit the scope of the impact so that we're not, we're losing a laptop, not an entire server's worth of financial data.
Makes sense. And so, Jay, how are you guys planning for it? Are you planning for this just being an ongoing conversation every quarter, every year as a part of that? Or is it something where you're like, this is going to be a part of our business and something we have to talk about for the next 5 to 7, and then it'll drastically decrease?
Yeah, I think Erik rightly stated that most of the people hit with ransomware who can't defend themselves have failed to protect reasonably against the start part and totally failed to have a reasonable backup strategy, recovery strategy. And we went through one of the guides right after the pipeline attack and said, hey, are we doing all these things? And we sort of went through the checklist. We could do this better. There's a couple of things right here. And then we said, okay, well, let's go ahead and just do some test restores. in the QA environment and just make sure these backups all actually work. Because you're saying that we've got really everything we need, and of course you go start restoring them, and you find out that 10% of them are broken in some way. Some of them were recorded as backed up, and the backup is empty. That doesn't seem right to me, right? So there's a diligence around this for ransomware. What I would tell you is ransomware is just the current grenade in the arsenal of things that are going on, and you are in a lifetime arms race. When ransomware is no longer the reasonable, interesting way to make money, they will have moved on to the next weapon. So we all have job security in that context until some AI takes over and gets rid of all the people.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And so we've kind of talked about some dour topics, right? And there's no clean and easy magic golden button that says it's just solved. Like, what's the good news? What's the next steps that I could leave from here if I'm listening and at this point utterly terrified? And I can walk away and go, if I go walk this checklist, I'm probably okay. I'm probably not great. I'm probably still at risk, but this will cover my first 90% or my first 60%. Like, what's that look like? Kind of starting with you, Jay, and then we'll go to Erik. Like, what are those top 3 or 4 things that everybody should go make sure you got this?
So I think that everybody's business looks different. So I think Erik already said there's no, one-stop shopping kind of approach to this. And I want to mention that I think that we're at the beginning of the turning the defensive part of the arms race into an offensive part of the arms race. You see the vendor proliferation of tools and technologies and the use of AI exploding right now. So there is a future, I could imagine, in 3 to 30 years, where we have significantly impacted people's ability to act against you, like proactively prevented that. So I don't think it's a insurmountable problem, but I do think it's going to take cooperation outside individual businesses going at this, or buying products from individual vendors. So I'll go back and answer now your question. I think that limiting the zero trust model and limiting privileged accounts as much as humanly possible is a starting point. And if you can get all the way to the secured checkout type of strategy for any privileged access, and then build the right multi-factor authentication strategies around that, you can certainly detect any attempts to circumvent your rules and to do harm. So there's opportunity there. If you're not using some sort of tooling to monitor your network traffic, looking at that traffic and saying, does all of this traffic look legitimate? Source, target, and content, right? And the SolarWinds is a great example of, well, it's all going to the SolarWinds server. That was perfectly okay. Where was it going after that, right? How did we end up with a VPN connection to the Netherlands? What's going on here, right? Detecting and intervening in those things proactively with the software, I think, is the next most important thing. And then the last thing is change your attack surface, right? I'm in the process of getting rid of my data center, and I'm never going to buy another piece of hardware for a data center ever again, right? If I own a server, it will be somebody else's VM that they are maintaining and giving me an ISO 20001 certificate for. And if they can't do that, I'm not hanging out with you. So that change your profile, right? That's the attack surface and the profile is another way to really meaningfully deal with this. And when you look at the total cost of ownership, I'll make this argument because I've seen this. I'm old, right? You can see some gray in my beard, maybe. I've seen this where great IT organizations slowly bog down in the concrete they made, and 80 or 90% of all the effort is treading water, keeping everything just like it is. safe, patched, secured, fully powered, on, working, lights blinking. And I don't want any employees doing that. That there's work to do there, but it's not value-added work to me. It's a platform as a service or software as a service that I just want to use an output of. And so the more I can isolate that, the less effort I'm putting into treading water, the more I can take the brain power of the brilliant people on this call, for example, and put them on problems we should solve. So that's it for me.
Erik, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, you asked for some good news, and I think the good news is the awareness that's being built across every set level, right? From government, from industry to the consumer. Having the awareness is part of that. It is part of the human weakness of the security equation. But also within the business, the awareness is now outside of the CISO's office, now outside the IT office, and is with the leadership as a whole. At a presentation by one of the interim CISOs from one of the major corporations that was breached in the last couple of years. He talked about how he basically had an unlimited budget post-breach. Pre-breach, of course, the budget was constrained, and do we really need to update that, and do we really need to fix that? Like all those sort of questions that every business has because it's a priority matrix, right? Mm-hmm. You get breached, they kind of get swept away. If you survive as a business, suddenly security is something you can afford because you just found out what it costs to not have it. And so I think that's an awareness that us in the IT industry can I'm not gonna say take advantage of in a negative way, in a positive way, and say, let's not have a conversation about what the post-breach unlimited budget looks like. Let's be smart and look at what the pre-breach or assumed breach budget looks like today, because clearly that's a smaller number than that post-breach number, right? And so can we go from where we're at, which is, oh, do we even need backups, to, yeah, we need backups, and like Jay said, we need to test them on a schedule, not to the, hey, we've been breached and now we're spending tons on PR and other costs that should never even have been part of the equation. So I think that's the good news, is the awareness that's happening is kind of bringing that, and as Jay pointed, the offensive side of that too, to start pushing back certainly helps.
So let me make sure to kind of try and summarize this. What I heard was use MFA. If you're not, please just do that. Just turn it on. It's a clicky button in almost every system at this point. Just clicky. Monitoring.
And everyone has multiple devices to help you do that.
Yep.
Yep. Pick your poison, but M365, Gmail, they'll all just do it for you because they want you to. MFA, some kind of logging and analysis system. Right? There's tons of them out there. Everything from the integrated Microsoft to Datadog to whatever. Pick one, and have it looking for you. And then continue to grow the awareness outside of the teams that are going to remediate the problem. Did I miss any of like the go make sure you do this? Change your profile and your platform, right? Look at the things you're actually doing and whether they're risky and you want to keep doing them, or they're risky and you want to stop. So I've got a couple of questions from the audience, and I've got kind of one last question for me. So we're going to start with some of the ones from the folks listening in. What about SCADA systems, right? Should we be worried and concerned about like the next Stuxnet? Like, where are we going? Do I need to worry about writing secure SCADA systems? And if so, how? So I'll pivot this one to Erik because he looks the most terrified for this question.
Terrified. I think it's more, there's nothing that we can stop doing, right? That's kind of the problem with security, is you don't get to stop doing the stuff that we've always had to do. We just have to keep adding. The part of that is, as security professionals, we have to find all 100 weaknesses. The hacker only has to find the one that they need to get in. And so if we have anything that we are doing right now that's helping with that, we're not going to get to stop doing it. It's not going to magically become, but the landscape does shift. And kind of it has become a lower risk. And at that point, can we shift it in priorities because other things have kind of superseded it?
Makes sense. So Jay, I'm gonna aim this one at you because you mentioned that you guys have a pretty good process for this. What's the best way to determine a dollar value for a risk? Right? Is there data on the type of different impacts that you looked at? Did you kind of gut feel it? Did you look at contracts and insurance coverage? Like, how did you go about a dollar value to risk?
That's a great question. We use an outside firm to help evaluate these, and they're using a combination of recent real world examples of the kinds of ransoms and things that were paid. They're looking at the legal liability in law. Take losing your privacy data, right? Like our CFO says, way up here is losing kids' names, birthdays, email addresses, home addresses. Way down here is all of our financial data. It's on the floor. If it got published in the journal tomorrow, they know we're doing really well. Darn it. Right? So understanding those kinds of things is really a big deal. And people value things based on their perception. When you get this third party view of it and really work through what's the real legal consequences and the real world cyber criminal consequences, you can put a dollar value on it pretty quickly, right? And then use the multiplier of risk profile probability, right? And come up with your, what's this worth? And I just recently saw one of those cartoons that Erik's story alluded to is, when you go to get $1 million for cybersecurity, the CFO's going, whoa, hold up. And when the cyber criminal says, I'll take $50 million to give you back your business, he's looking for the checkbook, right? Yeah. So it's having those conversations and as Erik said, exposing them in your leadership team and your board can really change that game, right? And that's the beauty of it, that a few successful attacks have everybody paying full attention right now. And so going through that, what does my risk surface look like? How can I minimize that? How can I minimize the amount of privilege I give out to individuals so that any individual account isn't going to kill me? Those kinds of things really make a huge difference in choosing mitigation strategies. Then finally, the budget to mitigate those things you can't, right? To try to detect and manage those things you can't.
That makes sense. And so I'm gonna wrap up with kind of one last question and go from there. But before we get to that, Jay, you mentioned you use an outside firm. Sounds like you're pretty happy with them. You mind sharing with everybody who that is so they can reach out?
Sure. So we coordinated this through Aiken Gump, which is a law firm that we use for much of our internal legal business, and they bring a whole host of other vendors to the table. And from time to time, we've said, oh, I liked them, but I've heard this other group is better. We are constantly, intentionally, I would say, seeking more opinions and diversity of these opinions so that we have a better sense of all the ideas that are out there. And the beauty of using our law firm is those cybersecurity tabletop exercises and the content around that remains privileged, which helps your business out in the event that you do end up in trouble.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with Erik and then I'll wrap up with you, Jay. So for me, security and the big difference to it was always a change of mindset, right? When I started looking at securing an application I was writing, less about putting guards at the doors, right? And more of putting cameras in the system. It's like, oh, okay, this makes sense to me. Like it was a mental shift of if I monitor the system rather than guard the edges, that's better. Doesn't mean that I don't guard the edges. It just means I'm probably better if I do both. And I spend more on monitoring than guards. And I always had this kind of physical mindset around it. And then when it transitioned from physical to digital, it was like, okay, I can actually have somebody go back through all that monitoring footage of our system and like analyze it and those kind of things. Those were the biggest mindset shifts for me when it came to security. What were the biggest mindset shifts for you that you'd like to share with somebody else? Who like, hey, if you can get your mind around this one, you'll be thinking about security better when it comes to securing your cloud and securing your infrastructure. What were those key moments for you and that you think would be impactful to others?
So for me, I think it's coming from a software development background back in the day as well. Thinking you could build things yourself was always an idea. To your point, you're trying to build better secure code, but recognizing that in security, there's strength in numbers. It's a 100% appropriate phrase, right? Because the identity proof management, for example, through a Okta or a Microsoft, they've got millions of people trying to log in, legitimate, illegitimate, all the things are happening. We would never have that data as a company of our size that says what is happening right now. And so the idea that building it yourself is not, and instead trusting a third party who is doing something at a much larger scale was one of those mind shifts to say, now I get why is it better to have a third party login? Well, because they have so much more capability around data and understanding and behavior analysis that a small company would just never have. And so you'd never even know something was happening because you don't have the aggregate intelligence. So that mind shift to say, let's put because you're giving up some control, you're taking a risk, right? But they are much more, because they're a target, they're actually more secure.
That makes sense. How about you, Jay? What was the big mindset that would be valuable for others to jump?
So you asked specifically around the cloud, and I think that was realizing the big cloud vendors are halfway to reasonable security models, and making it easy for you to understand how you're secured was the biggest epiphany for me I've been working in Azure as a consumer-facing cloud platform for a while, and they have come miles in just the last couple of years, right? But there are still buttons you have to find and push, and they are not easy to find nor easy to push to really make that platform secure. And it seems to me the vendors aren't doing enough to help the average CIO consumer, right, or DevOps team or other people correctly do that work. It's a paid consulting engagement 95 times out of 100, right? And the other 5% leak more. So that's aggravating to me, but I think it was a real epiphany that this is going to be just as hard as owning my data center for a while, but I've moved the surface at least, and I'm focused on a different set of problems now that I think are more manageable.
Awesome. So don't build it all yourself. And even if you're buying it, you're going to have to do some work to secure it.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, I greatly appreciate you guys spending an hour talking about the state of security, how we get better at it, and kind of coming together as an industry. I'm looking forward to the digital security equivalent of the National Highway Safety Board. Doing crash tests on software. So we'll see if that happens. Thanks, everybody. Yeah. Have a great one.
Thanks, guys.